In the first weeks after the Allied landings at Normandy, American infantry moved into a landscape that seemed built for ambush. The bocage, a patchwork of small fields bounded by earthen banks up to 4 feet high, topped with dense hedgerows of thorn and root, turned every field into an enclosed box. Visibility inside these corridors rarely exceeded 50 to 100 meters. For an advancing rifle squad, each hedgerow ahead was a wall of unknown space. Hidden inside that unknown space, again and again, was a single German rifleman with a scoped carabiner 98K, positioned to fire one aimed shot and then disappear before return fire could be organized. Allied after-action reports from June and July 1944 describe entire advances stalling for hours because of a single hidden shooter. Officers, NCOs, and radio operators were disproportionately targeted, a standard practice among trained marksmen seeking to disrupt command and communication at the squad and platoon level. The problem American commanders faced was not simply that they were being shot at, it was that they could not answer a basic tactical question fast enough. Where is he? A hidden man with a rifle, using cover correctly, is nearly invisible. Muzzle flash from a modern smokeless rifle cartridge is brief and in daylight difficult to see at range. The crack of a passing bullet seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. For the Green replacement troops who made up a large share of American rifle companies in the summer of 1944, this uncertainty was often more dangerous than the enemy fire itself because it produced hesitation, and hesitation in the bocage got men killed. What emerged over the following months, distributed through training manuals, veteran instruction, and hard experience, was not a secret weapon or a piece of classified technology. It was a method of listening, a way of taking two ordinary, unavoidable sounds produced by every rifle shot and using the physics of how those sounds traveled to work out, with meaningful accuracy, where the shot had come from. It gave ordinary riflemen a tool that no manual before the war had formally taught them, and it is the subject of this account. The story of that tool runs backward through decades of unrelated science before it runs forward into the fields of Normandy, through a physics laboratory in the 1880s, through the artillery duels of the First World War, and finally into the hands of infantrymen who never studied acoustics but who learned, out of necessity, to hear something their enemies assumed they could not. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand what each army brought into Normandy and why the terrain itself amplified the imbalance between them. The German Wehrmacht entered the Second World War with an established tradition of designated marksmanship, inherited in part from the Imperial German Army of the First World War, which had fielded telescopic-sighted rifles in numbers that alarmed the Allies at the time. By the late 1930s, the Wehrmacht was issuing carabiner 98K rifles fitted with the ZF-39 and later ZF-41 telescopic sights to selected marksmen within infantry companies, supported by a doctrine that emphasized concealment, patience, and single, deliberate shots at high-value targets, officers, radio men, and machine gun crews, followed by immediate repositioning. This was not a specialized commando unit. It was an organic capability built into ordinary infantry formations, meaning that nearly every German company in Normandy had at least a handful of soldiers trained to fight this way. The United States Army, by contrast, entered the war without a standing sniper school. This is a documented gap in American training infrastructure at the time. While the Army maintained advanced marksmanship instruction at ranges such as Camp Perry, Ohio, there was no dedicated program producing trained snipers, and just as importantly, no formal program training ordinary riflemen how to locate and counter them. Individual training instead emphasized rifle marksmanship, fire and maneuver, and small unit tactics against visible or suppressed targets, not the specific problem of a single well-hidden shooter using one round and vanishing. This asymmetry meant that when American infantry divisions entered the close, compartmentalized terrain of the Normandy bocage, they were, in a narrow but critical sense, improvising a solution to a problem their training had not directly addressed. The bocage itself made the problem worse than it would have been almost anywhere else in the European theater. Centuries of Norman farmers had piled stones cleared from their fields into long earthen mounds to mark field boundaries and pen livestock. Over generations, these mounds had grown into dense, root-bound banks topped with trees and thorn hedges, connecting field after field into a maze with almost no long sightlines. American armor found the terrain nearly as punishing as the infantry did. Sherman tanks attempting to climb the banks exposed their thinly armored undersides to German anti-tank fire, a separate mechanical problem that would not find its own field solution until Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division's 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, welded scavenged German beach obstacles into hedge-cutting tusks in July 1944, a device nicknamed the Rhino that General Omar Bradley ordered fitted to as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra. That armored solution, however, lay weeks in the future for the infantry squads moving through the same hedgerows in June, on foot, with nothing but their own senses to work with. The acoustic improvisation those squads developed would draw, whether the soldiers using it understood the physics or not, on more than 2 decades of acoustic science developed originally for an entirely different battlefield problem: locating enemy artillery. Before the method that eventually proved useful took hold, several approaches to the sniper problem proved inadequate, and the record of their failure is itself part of the story. The most basic instinct, returning fire in the general direction a shot seemed to come from, was understandably common among green troops but was frequently ineffective in the bocage. A single crack heard through hedge and earthen bank gives almost no reliable directional information to an untrained ear because the sound reflects and reverberates off the banks themselves. Firing blindly into a hedgerow not only failed to suppress a well-concealed shooter but wasted ammunition and revealed the position of the squad doing the firing. Visual reconnaissance, the method most infantry training emphasized, also struggled in this terrain. German riflemen were trained to select firing positions that offered concealment from ground-level observation, often firing through small gaps in foliage rather than from an exposed edge. Even trained observers scanning a hedgerow with binoculars frequently could not identify a shooter's position after a single shot, because there was no sustained muzzle flash or smoke signature from smokeless propellant to fix on, and the shooter typically moved immediately after firing. A related failure came from the artillery-oriented acoustic methods developed in the First World War. Sound ranging, pioneered on the Western Front from 1915 onward, had been designed to locate the general position of enemy artillery batteries kilometers behind the lines, using arrays of microphones spread several kilometers apart and precise timing equipment to plot a gun's coordinates by triangulating the arrival of its report at multiple stations. This system, refined by scientists including the physicist William Lawrence Bragg and engineer William Sansom Tucker on the British side, was accurate to a matter of meters under good conditions, but it required a network of fixed listening posts, specialized recording equipment, and processing time measured in minutes. It was built to answer "Where is that battery?" for a corps commander, not "Where is that rifleman?" for a squad leader with seconds to react. Early unscientific oral sound ranging attempts using only stopwatches and a pair of widely spaced microphones had also been tried and discarded by the Western Allies as too imprecise even for the artillery problem, further underlining that a simpler solution, workable in real time by an individual soldier without instruments, was needed for the infantry version of this challenge. The German army had, in fact, already experimented with a variant of oral sound ranging during the First World War, and had continued to rely on it even after Allied scientists moved to more rigorous methods, a choice history records as comparatively ineffective. This earlier German experience is a useful reminder that acoustic locating of weapons fire was neither a new idea nor an automatically reliable one. Its value depended entirely on how precisely the method matched the scale of the problem it was applied to. A microphone network built to find a battery of guns several kilometers away could not simply be shrunk down and handed to an infantry squad. What the squad needed was not more sensitive equipment, but a different application of the same acoustic principle, one that traded precision for speed and required no equipment at all beyond a trained pair of ears. None of these approaches, blind return fire, visual scanning, or full-scale artillery sound ranging, was suited to the specific tactical unit of measure that mattered in the bocage: a single rifle squad in seconds with only its own ears. Several documented figures and institutions sit behind the method that eventually reached the rifle squad in the hedgerow, even though none of them set out to solve the specific problem of the individual sniper. Ernst Mach, the Austrian physicist and philosopher of science, is the earliest of them. Working at the German University in Prague in the 1880s, Mach was investigating the behavior of projectiles moving faster than sound, a subject of interest to ballisticians of the era who needed to understand what happened to artillery shells and bullets once they exceeded the speed at which air could get out of the way ahead of them. His photographic evidence of the shock wave, the physical structure that produces the crack a soldier hears when a bullet passes nearby, remains foundational to supersonic aerodynamics and ballistics to this day. A generation later, the demands of trench warfare on the Western Front pushed a different set of scientists to apply acoustic principles at the scale of a battlefield. William Lawrence Bragg, already a Nobel laureate in physics for his work on X-ray crystallography, and William Sansom Tucker, an engineer and inventor, were central to Britain's development of scientific sound ranging for artillery location beginning around 1915 and 1916, work that replaced the cruder stopwatch and microphone methods used earlier in the war with instrumented, mathematically rigorous triangulation. The final link in the chain, as far as this account is concerned, is institutional rather than individual. The War Department office responsible for FM 2175, Scouting, Patrolling, and Sniping, published in 1944, which took the acoustic principle already well established in artillery circles and wrote it, for the first time in American doctrine, into the training expectations of ordinary infantry scouts. Alongside it stood the U.S. Army's Field Artillery Observation Battalions, including the 285th, whose day-to-day operational use of sound and flash ranging in the same European theater kept the acoustic tradition institutionally alive and demonstrated its continued military relevance throughout the war. The method that did work was grounded in a physical phenomenon first rigorously documented more than 50 years before the Normandy campaign by the Austrian physicist Ernst Mach. In 1887 and 1888, working at the German University in Prague, Mach used a photographic technique now known as Schlieren photography to capture images of projectiles moving faster than the speed of sound. His photographs revealed a cone-shaped shockwave trailing behind a supersonic object, a compression of air that spreads outward from the projectile's path much like the wake behind a boat, but in 3 dimensions and moving at the speed of sound itself. This shockwave, when it crosses a listener's position, is heard as a sharp, cracking report entirely distinct from any sound made at the object's point of origin. Mach's work established the scientific vocabulary, the Mach cone, and the ratio of an object's speed to the speed of sound, later formalized as the Mach number, that would eventually explain a sound every combat soldier in the 20th century would come to know. A rifle bullet fired at typical infantry combat ranges is supersonic for most or all of its flight. The German 7.92 x 57 mm Mauser cartridge used in the Karabiner 98K left the muzzle at roughly 760 to 880 meters per second, depending on load and barrel length, more than twice the speed of sound in air, which is approximately 340 meters per second at typical battlefield temperatures. 2 separate sound events are therefore produced by every rifle shot fired at a nearby target. The first is the miniature sonic boom generated as the supersonic bullet passes near or over the listener, the crack. The second is the sound of the muzzle blast itself, the gunpowder gases expanding out of the barrel at the moment of firing, the thump, or bang, because the bullet travels toward the listener faster than sound. And because it typically passes closer to the listener than the muzzle itself, the crack normally arrives first, followed by the thump traveling from the origin point at the fixed, slower speed of sound. This produces 2 usable pieces of information. First, the interval of time between hearing the crack and hearing the thump correlates, in a rough but genuine way, with the shooter's approximate range. The longer the gap up to a point, the farther away the muzzle blast has to travel relative to the passing bullet. Second, and often more valuable at close infantry ranges, the 2 sounds arrive from different directions. The crack seems to come from along the bullet's flight path near the listener, while the thump comes from the actual position of the shooter. A trained ear hearing both in sequence could triangulate a bearing to the muzzle blast far more reliably than by reacting to a single ambiguous report. This is the method later generations of soldiers would simply call crack thump, and its underlying mechanism, a supersonic shockwave preceding a subsonic muzzle report, is precisely the phenomenon Mach had photographed in a Prague laboratory half a century earlier. None of this required equipment. It required only that a soldier be taught to listen for 2 sounds instead of 1, to understand that they were not the same event, and to use the direction of the second sound, the thump, as the more reliable indicator of the shooter's actual position, while treating the first, the crack, as a rough warning that a shot had passed dangerously close. The reliability of this method was not uniform across all distances, a limitation that later, more systematic study of the phenomenon would confirm. At very short range, the crack and thump arrive close enough together that the ear struggles to separate them into 2 distinct events, effectively collapsing the technique into an instinctive sense that a shot has come from nearby without a usable bearing. At the other extreme, beyond several hundred meters, the interval between crack and thump becomes long enough that other cues, echo, wind, terrain reflection, begin to distort the picture, and the correlation between the interval and the true range weakens. Between these two extremes lies a working range, corresponding closely to the distances at which most rifle engagements in the bocage actually took place, within which the technique gives its clearest and most actionable results. This is precisely the range band in which German snipers, constrained by the short sightlines of the hedgerow terrain, were forced to operate, meaning the environment that made concealment easiest for the shooter also happened to be the environment in which the crack-thump method worked best for the listener. It is also worth being precise about what the method could and could not tell a soldier. It did not by itself reveal a shooter's exact position. It could not substitute for eyes on a hidden man in a hedge. What it reliably provided was a bearing, a direction, and a rough sense of distance, sufficient to turn an undirected search of an entire field into a focused search of one section of one hedgerow. That narrowing of the search space from somewhere out there to roughly there was the entire tactical value of the technique, and it is why the method survived and spread even though no soldier using it in 1944 needed to know Ernst Mach's name or understand the mathematics of a shock cone to apply it correctly. The United States Army codified this listening technique in official doctrine during the war itself. Field Manual 2175, Scouting, Patrolling, and Sniping, published by the War Department in 1944, included instruction on locating hostile fire by sound as part of the scouting and observation skills expected of infantrymen and designated scouts. This placed for the first time in American doctrine a formal expectation that ordinary soldiers, not specialized sound-ranging technicians, would be trained to distinguish and interpret the separate acoustic signatures of enemy small arms fire. In practice, however, the transmission of this skill during the Normandy campaign and the broader Northwest Europe campaign of 1944-45 ran through both formal instruction and the informal, often faster-moving channel of veterans replacement teaching that characterized much of the U.S. Army's wartime infantry culture. American rifle companies took heavy and continuous casualties throughout the summer of 1944, and replacement soldiers arriving at the front were frequently instructed in survival skills, among them listening for the crack before reacting to the thump, by NCOs and privates who had already spent weeks in the hedgerows learning the same lesson at cost. This pattern of experience-based skill transfer, common across Allied infantry units in every theater of the war, meant the technique spread through combat units even faster than official manuals alone could have achieved. The same underlying acoustic science was, at the institutional level, already in active use elsewhere in the same theater of war, U.S. Army Field Artillery Observation Battalions, including the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, operated in the European theater using the sound and flash technique, the direct descendant of the First World War sound ranging systems, to locate German artillery positions, including during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The presence of dedicated sound ranging units at the Corps and Army level, working the same fundamental physics at a larger scale, demonstrates that acoustic localization was not a novelty improvised only by frightened riflemen. It was a recognized, doctrinally supported method of target acquisition across multiple scales of the U.S. Army, from a six-man squad reacting to a sniper's single shot to a specialized battalion locating an artillery battery kilometers away. As the campaign moved out of the bocage following the American breakout at St. Lo in late July 1944, and as fighting shifted into more open terrain across France, Belgium, and eventually into Germany itself, the same listening discipline continued to apply and expanded in application beyond the specific problem of the individual sniper. The crack-thump distinction proved equally relevant to distinguishing incoming machine gun fire from outgoing friendly fire, to estimating rough distances to enemy positions during static defensive periods, and to training new arrivals quickly in an environment where formal schooling was a luxury few units could afford. The technique required no equipment, no specialized personnel, and no time beyond the instant of the shot itself, which made it uniquely scalable. It could be taught by any experienced soldier to any new one, in the field in minutes, at zero cost in resources that were otherwise perpetually scarce. At the institutional level, sound ranging as a discipline continued to be applied by observation battalions throughout the remainder of the European campaign, and would remain part of standard field artillery target acquisition doctrine well after the war's end. The post-war Army retained instruction in acoustic target location for infantry marksmanship training as well, a 1957 U.S. Army Rifle Marksmanship Field Manual documents locating targets by sound as a standing training subject tied directly back to FM 2175. showing that what had begun as wartime improvisation and doctrine had, within little more than a decade, become an established and continuously taught element of American infantry training rather than a wartime expedient later forgotten. This expansion also illustrates something notable about how battlefield knowledge propagates. The version of acoustic locating practiced by a rifle squad in a Norman hedgerow, and the version practiced by a field artillery observation battalion tracking a battery from kilometers away, were at bottom applications of the same physical principle at radically different scales, one requiring only trained hearing in seconds of time, the other requiring microphone arrays, timing instruments, and trained technicians processing data over minutes. That the U.S. Army was operating both versions simultaneously, often within the same divisions and corps, meant the institutional infrastructure and cultural familiarity with acoustic target location were already present in the force structure by the time infantry doctrine formally caught up and wrote the infantry scale version into a field manual. In this sense, FM 2175 did not introduce a wholly new idea to the Army. It extended an existing acoustic tradition, developed for artillery, down to the level of the individual rifleman. The tactical impact of the crack-thump method should be described carefully and without exaggeration. It did not make American squads immune to sniper fire, and it did not turn ordinary riflemen into expert marksmen capable of instantly killing a hidden shooter. German snipers continued to inflict casualties throughout the Normandy campaign and beyond, and the terrain of the bocage remained dangerous for advancing infantry through the summer of 1944. What the method did provide was a meaningful reduction in the paralysis of uncertainty. A squad that could form even an approximate bearing toward a shooter's position, rather than none at all, could call in supporting fire from mortars or machine guns onto that general area, could maneuver a fire team to flank the position rather than advancing blindly into it, and could communicate a usable direction up the chain of command rather than a vague report of, "We are taking fire from somewhere ahead." This shift from zero actionable information to approximate but real actionable information mattered enormously in a tactical environment measured in seconds and dozens of meters. For German riflemen trained under a doctrine that depended on concealment, a single shot, and immediate repositioning, the value of that doctrine rested on the enemy's inability to react quickly to a single report. A method that gave American squads even a rough, fast bearing toward the muzzle blast worked directly against that assumption. It did not require the American side to see the shooter, only to react toward the correct quadrant of the field fast enough to compress the shooter's window for safe repositioning. Combined with broader countermeasures adopted during and after the Normandy fighting, including the Kulin Rhino hedge-cutting devices fitted to roughly 3 of every 5 American First Army tanks by the time of Operation Cobra, which opened new lines of sight and movement through terrain that had previously belonged entirely to the defender. Along with standard combined arms suppression using mortars and artillery against suspected positions, the net effect over the course of the summer of 1944 was a steady erosion of the tactical advantage that concealment alone had given German marksmen at the campaign's outset. This is also the point at which the documentary title's premise deserves an honest, unembellished accounting rather than a dramatized one. There is no single wartime document in which a German sniper is recorded expressing bewilderment at American reaction times, and no responsible historical account should invent one. What the documented record does support is narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. That American infantry, entering Normandy with no formal counter-sniper training, closed a meaningful part of the gap between themselves and a trained adversary within weeks, using a method that cost nothing, required no equipment, and could be taught by any veteran to any replacement in the field. Whatever a German marksman may privately have concluded about why his American opposite numbers were reacting faster than the doctrine he had been trained under assumed they would, the underlying cause was not mysterious. It was 2 ordinary sounds, correctly interpreted. The crack-thump principle did not end with the Second World War. It persisted as a taught skill through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and into the modern era of U.S. Army infantry and sniper training, appearing in successive generations of marksmanship and fieldcraft manuals as a basic counter-sniper listening skill for individual soldiers. Its most significant evolution came with the application of electronic sensors and digital signal processing to the same underlying physics that Ernst Mach had photographed in 1888 and that American infantrymen had learned to recognize by ear in 1944. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the U.S. Army fielded acoustic gunshot detection systems such as the Boomerang system, developed with support from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and BBN Technologies, mounted on vehicles operating in Iraq and Afghanistan. These systems use arrays of microphones to detect both the shockwave of a passing supersonic bullet and the muzzle blast of the weapon that fired it, calculating the shooter's bearing and approximate range within a fraction of a second, and displaying the result to the vehicle's crew. An automated, instrument-driven execution of precisely the crack and thump reasoning that an infantryman in the Normandy bocage had once performed with nothing but trained hearing. Related acoustic detection technology has since spread into civilian use as well, most visibly in gunshot detection systems deployed by police departments in American cities, which use networks of fixed microphones to triangulate the location of gunfire in urban environments using the same fundamental principle of comparing the arrival times and characteristics of a weapon's acoustic signature at multiple sensor points. A direct descendant, several technological generations removed, of the sound-ranging arrays first developed on the Western Front during the First World War. The continuity across this entire span of history is worth stating plainly, because it is easy to miss inside a story that moves from a Prague physics laboratory to a French hedgerow to a modern armored vehicle. In every case, the underlying event being measured is identical. A projectile exceeding the speed of sound generates a shockwave that a sensor, whether a human ear or a microphone diaphragm, detects before the sound of the projectile's launch arrives from its point of origin. Ernst Mach's contribution was to photograph and mathematically describe that shockwave. The First World War Sound Ranger's contribution was to show that arrays of sensors could use sound arrival times to locate a weapon's position at operationally useful distances. The U.S. Army's contribution, formalized in FM 2175 in 1944 and taught first informally and then formally to riflemen in Normandy, was to recognize that the same principle, stripped down to its simplest possible form, could be executed by an untrained ear in real time without any instrument at all. And the Boomerang system's contribution, 6 decades later, was to replace that trained human ear with a microphone array and a processor capable of doing the same triangulation in a fraction of a second, correcting for the very sources of error, wind, terrain, temperature, that had always limited the accuracy of the human version. Each stage did not discard the one before it. Each simply moved the same physical measurement to a different combination of speed, precision, and available technology. The problem that faced American infantry in the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944 was, at its core, a problem of information. A hidden man with a rifle held an overwhelming advantage for as long as the soldiers around him could not answer a simple question fast enough: where is he? The solution that emerged was not a new weapon, a secret device, or a specialized unit. It was the recognition, formalized in a 1944 field manual and spread hand to hand through veteran instruction in the field, that a rifle shot is not one sound but two, arriving from two different points in space and time, and that an ordinary soldier could be taught in minutes to tell them apart. That principle, rooted in physics established in a Prague laboratory in 1888 and first applied at scale to warfare through the sound-ranging battalions of the First World War, gave American squads in 1944 something they had not been formally trained to have: a fast, low-cost, equipment-free method of narrowing an impossible search to a workable direction. It did not defeat every German sniper, and it did not end the danger of the bocage, but it shifted, shot by shot, the balance between a hidden marksman's silence and a squad's ability to answer it. What makes this account worth telling is not a single dramatic reveal, but the shape of the history itself. A piece of pure physics, documented by a scientist with no interest in infantry combat, adapted by artillery engineers solving an entirely different problem of scale, written into doctrine almost as an afterthought in a 1944 field manual, and then carried into the field far faster by word of mouth between frightened, fast-learning soldiers than by any manual at all. It is a reminder that the tools which decide small, desperate engagements are not always the newest or most sophisticated available to an army. Sometimes they are the oldest and simplest, waiting only for someone to notice that they apply. And that shift, small and unglamorous as it was in the summer of 1944, is why a technique with no name beyond crack thump still appears 8 decades later in the electronics mounted on modern armored vehicles, built on the same two sounds a rifle has always made.